Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the gap theory. So for starters, what is the gap theory? Basically, it's a theory that states there's a gap of time of millions or billions of years between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2. Alright, now before we move on to broader topics, let's actually take a look at these couple of verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Right there, between those two verses, is where our gap takes place. Next, we'll look at what exactly gap theorists believe. First, and most obviously, there's a gap between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2. God created the world, and then something caused it to become without form and void. The gap could have been millions of years long. During the gap, prehistoric creatures lived and died. Lucifer, or Satan, was in charge of the gap world, but when he fell from grace, God destroyed it in a Luciferian flood. After this, God remade the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. But why? They created this theory to allow or accommodate for the millions or billions of years that evolutionary geologists call for. Now let's compare some large topics concerning the gap theorists and creationists. To start, the flood. Here we'll see what sort of implication Lucifer's flood causes for Noah's global flood. Gap theorists believe that Lucifer's flood was solely responsible for creating the fossil record. Since they believe this, gap theorists must also accept that Noah's global flood had left zero trace. They must then conclude that Noah's flood was merely a local flood affecting few people and animals. Because of this, they have removed all evidence of God's judgment in Noah's flood, which is also the basis of God's warning for judgment to come, in order to make the fossil record work for the gap flood. Now, what do we know from Genesis concerning the flood? First of all, the flood was absolutely, without a doubt, a punishment for man's sins. Also, there were only 8 people and 2 of every kind of land-dwelling animal that survived the flood. Everything else drowned in the flood. Second, it is far more consistent with Scripture to say that most fossils come from Noah's flood. Believing in Lucifer's flood is merely speculation and adds nothing to biblical understanding and science. And finally, there is no reference to a Luciferian flood anywhere in Scripture. Alright, now let's move on to a new topic, the age of the Earth. So quite obviously, the gap theorists believe in an old Earth, as that's precisely what they're trying to accomplish with this whole theory. A way to account for the millions of years that evolutionary geologists talk about. Gap theorists ignore all evidence for a young Earth, such as decay and rapid reversals of the Earth's magnetic field, the amount of salt in the oceans, and the wind-up of spiral galaxies. Now on to the next topic, uniformitarianism versus catastrophism. To start, some definitions. This is the belief that natural processes has always happened at the same rate as they do today, whereas catastrophism is a belief that the rate of natural processes change because of catastrophes. This is where gap theorists is failing. They take the word of evolutionary geologists and come up with a catastrophe that creates millions of years. However, they don't include the geologist's strong belief in uniformitarianism. This doesn't make sense, now does it? It seems far more likely that they're picking and choosing some random beliefs from two sides of the spectrum and putting it together to come up with a gap theory. Alright, I believe now it's time to start wrapping up. So, in conclusion, there is not a gap between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2. And second, there's definitely not a Luciferian flood at any time. Yes, it accounts for the millions of years that evolutionists agree on, but it doesn't follow the rest of the beliefs, like uniformitarianism. Regardless, we know that is impossible according to Scripture. We know from there that the earth is young, and when God created the world, it was perfect. If there was a gap with a flood before the 6-day creation, it wouldn't be perfect, as sin and death would have already entered the world through Satan. As an ending note, I'll leave you with this text from Colossians 2, verse 8. Don't let anyone capture you with empty philosophies and high-sounding nonsense that come from human thinking and from the spiritual powers of this world, rather than from Christ. We must know to be careful with these different theories and beliefs, making sure that we don't get caught up with all of it, and stay focused on our own faith. We can know that the Scripture is true and anything else must be analyzed carefully.